and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. We begin with the Chinese telecom giant Huawei. On Wednesday, U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order that bars American firms from buying equipment from companies deemed as so-called national security threat. Separately, the U.S. Commerce Department said it would add Huawei to a so-called entity, meaning a blacklist, restricting its purchase from American suppliers. In response, the Chinese Commerce Ministry said Thursday that the United States should avoid increasing China-U.S. trade tensions. Amid overseas pressure, Huawei released its first AI-native database in Beijing on Wednesday. Before we get to our discussion about the reality and future for Huawei and U.S.-China trade situation, take a look at this.
No trace of anxiety at a Huawei launch product ceremony in Beijing on Wednesday. Across the Pacific, the company had received its latest blow from the U.S. government. According to Reuters, Huawei and its affiliates will be placed on a so-called entity list, making it difficult or impossible for American companies to sell components to the Chinese telecom giants. In a statement, the Shenzhen-based company said that restricting Huawei will not make the U.S. safer and stronger, but instead will only make the American 5G development lag behind, as the country will be forced to buy non-Huawei equipment that are expensive and poorly made. Chinese telecom companies are no stranger to legal battles with the American government.
By shutting them down, we're hurting a lot of American companies, really good American companies.
The founder of Huawei, Ren Zhengfei, gave interviews full of confidence. He said that eventually the U.S. and European countries will open their doors to Huawei because Huawei makes things that these countries simply must have. Just who will get the last laugh, if there's anyone laughing at all? The test has begun.
So who will get the last laugh? I guess that's an evolving process. So what's next for Huawei and the U.S.-China trade situation? Let's loop in our panelists. With us in Beijing studio, Annie Mok, who is a non-resident fellow of the Center for China and Globalization. In Shanghai, we are joined by Shen Yi, a researcher of the Center for Communication and State Governance Research in Fudan University. In Washington, D.C., the U.S., Ernest McDuffie, good to see you, the founder of the Global McDuffie Group. And in Boston, Roger Antner, the founder and lead analyst of Recon Analytics. I want to welcome the four of you gentlemen joining us on this very important topic. First of all, may I ask you, Mr. Antner, what exactly are some of the answers to quite a number of questions people raised about both the executive order and then the so-called entity list given by the Commerce Department? For example, what about now until 150 days later? What is going to be happening to the hardware already provided by Huawei to the American systems, whether it's in urban or rural areas? There are a lot of questions over there. Why there are so many questions when you have an executive order being issued and also the Commerce Department trying at least to set some regulations and rules? Why so many loopholes?
The executive order is very broad. It doesn't single out any country and any company, but the direction is quite clear that it's directed at China and companies. The most high profile here is Huawei, even though Huawei has relatively little exposure in the United States. It only does business with some small rural telcos, and we don't know how this will proceed. And most likely Huawei will no longer be able to provide it to these small rural companies, and they eventually potentially have to rip it out. So the loopholes and the flexibility gives them a lot of leverage to use that in other negotiations.
I see. Go to you, Mr. McDuffie. What are these loopholes or the, the place and space that can be used to maneuver for the administration? One thing is very important. Whether this is about a thing limiting Huawei or this is a strategic move against Chinese tech companies as a whole, or this is a tool for the current China-U.S. trade negotiations, tool, of course, for the Trump administration.
So probably all of the above. I have no real insight into what the Trump administration's thoughts are about all this, but what's being ignored is that there's a larger problem, bigger than Huawei and China and U.S., that deals with the global supply chain. There's security issues around all types of technology that are produced globally and used in different countries around the globe, of understanding who's putting what parts and what components into each piece of hardware, and how do you guarantee that there are no backdoors and everything is secure. That's a global problem for the entire community.
Yeah. Mr. Shen, of course, there are two things that we can understand from both the executive order and also the Commerce Department announcement. Two things coming on two directions. One is that American companies are not allowed to buy anymore, according to executive order, companies that are so-called supported by the adversary governments. Of course, it's not being explained who the adversaries are, but let's say if Huawei were one of those on the list, this is one direction. The other direction is Huawei is being prevented, according to the Commerce Department entity list, to buy components coming from so-called American supplier from now on, knowing that 33%, or rather 33 out of the 90 suppliers of Huawei are American companies. So, Mr. Shen, how should we understand this both directions? If implemented, not just a negotiation tool, what would that mean for Huawei from your perspective?
It's a double-sided sword for Huawei, of course, to raise obstacles and threat the security of the supply chain of Huawei companies. But we all know that Huawei already declared that it has systems to ensure its own supply chain securities. That we will finally see the final result if it's really deployed in certain times. But on the other side, we need to understand that it's a double-sided sword. If those companies selling high technological components to Huawei cannot sell this component to Huawei, who need this? Who has enough technical capacities to buy these components and transfer them into effective, efficiency 5G telecommunication productions, which can bring them back the benefits, which is the key obstacles or key goals for the commercial or the business activities. We need to see these questions in two sides. And if all these two sides, the executive orders and the list have effect, not only Huawei but its American suppliers will get damaged simultaneously.
We already know that in the stock market over the past 24 hours, there are companies that are suffering, American companies, Qualcomm, for example, Lumentum, for example, and there are likely to be more. Meanwhile, there are other companies that would be, quote-unquote, substitute suppliers for Huawei, such as those coming from European countries or from parts of Asia, are actually having their stocks rising. If you look at the market, it's already telling some stories. So, Mr. Ma, here in Beijing, how do you see the current drama? This is one thing. And secondly, how do you correlate to your colleague earlier, Mr. McDuffie said, this is going to be a disturbance to the global supply chain, and whether this is going to set a very bad precedence for all the other companies or governments who want to do whatever with the global supply chain?
Well, I think drama is a great word, Tianwei. I mean, really.
I try to select a neutral word as much as possible.
Yeah. I mean, it really is creating a lot of drama, a lot of distress, and opportunities you mentioned. I think the biggest risk to the global supply chain here is that everyone recognizes that Huawei is not only the technology leader, but also the cost leader. So by excluding Huawei from the U.S. market, I think the U.S. risks falling behind, not just risk, but it will fall behind in 5G. American companies, as you mentioned, are being hurt because if they're blocked from selling to Huawei, which has had an amazing year last year, over $100 billion in revenue. Their first quarter 2019 revenues were up almost 40%. So it's a growth company, and for American companies to miss out on that, I think would be a shame, and that would be not a drama, but a tragedy.
In a media statement Huawei put out, it said restricting it from doing business in the United States will not make the country, meaning the U.S., more secure or stronger, but it will eventually harm the interests of U.S. companies and consumers. That, of course, has been said by many of our panelists also over the past few minutes as well. But now, here is the thing, Mr. Antener. So we all know this might not be, besides the geopolitical goals, a smart choice made by the current administration in the U.S. Whether relevant companies, interest groups, as well as governments will be able to communicate with the current administration and be able to modify what is going on right now in the executive order and also in the Commerce Department, not to mention the other departments of the United States. Current administration might also be following the executive order because it's so-called across the board.
So I think, first of all, I think the United States will not fall behind in the 5G race. There are, as mentioned, there are other vendors that are active here in the United States, like Nokia, Samsung, and Ericsson. But American consumers are certainly losing out on devices like the flagship Huawei devices that are world leading. We will see how this will actually get implemented. We have to remember that ZTE was on the same entities list and ultimately got pulled off the list as well. So I think we're here at the very early stages of that drama that you have alluded to, and I think you know, a meal is eaten not as hot as it's being cooked. So right now we have to look at this in a multifaceted approach, that there are, on one hand, persistent security concerns for more than 10 years, regardless of administration. And there's the ongoing trade negotiation with China, with the current administration. And this certainly ratchets up the pressure and the stakes. And it makes it much harder to negotiate, because if there are economic disagreements, there can be compromise. It's much harder to find compromise on national security grounds.
Okay. Well, whether it is a slowly cooked, steamed, or stir-fried, Mr. Antener, we'll have to see. But that is a great analogy, I would assume, Mr. Mark, that to what extent China should react. And if that is a precedent being set by the American company, barring a Chinese company, this time Huawei, even bigger than ZTE, going into the American market and also buy supplies from the American suppliers, would that also mean to the American companies that are doing business here in China, selling to the Chinese consumer market and also getting supplies from the Chinese suppliers? So reciprocal has been the word used by this administration a lot. So what does that mean? Is there a potential something like this, Mr. Mark?
Well, I think it's certainly possible, but I think one thing we need to recognize is that China has unequivocally come out for greater openness and integration with the rest of the world.
But in a trade dispute, that is not necessarily going to be the case. It might be
Sure.
open to the rest of the world, but not the United States if
Yes.
one party continues to do that, right?
No, I think
there's
that
a potential of that possibility.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think what I wanted to go on to say with that, but within this broader direction of greater openness, I think China, of course, has to defend its national interest and also the interest of its companies as well,
Right.
Which, of course, there's an overlap, but there's also a difference. But I think it would be very disappointing for the U.S. to abandon its principles of open markets, because I think that would be a signal that perhaps it's lost confidence in its ability to compete. And of course that may happen, but I think it would be very unfortunate for the United States and the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and China.
Mr. Shen, on the bigger picture, may I ask you, the U.S. has been pushing the other capitals around the world, particular allies in Europe, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, and you name it, to ban Huawei before it bans Huawei itself. Now, the U.S. apparently is trying to ban Huawei, if you believe what the interpretations are. So, will the U.S. turn around and say to its allies, okay, I did it, see? So why didn't you guys do it? But the question really is, will others follow suit? Just follow the example of the United States, or they should take care of their own interests as well. So, Mr. Shen, help us to understand this.
I think that the state actors is rational. The rational means they consider their interest first. If the United States want to persuade its allies, it needs to providing the logic, providing the evidence. But frankly speaking, till now, the United States did not have enough evidence which is confidence enough to persuade all the allies to take actions. And the second, Huawei providing 5G. 5G is next generation communication tools which bring benefits to thousands of people all around the world. If those countries want to sacrifice their own benefit during these revolutions, frankly speaking, if you join together all these markets from the United States and together with allies, it's not representing the majority of the whole market in the world. The other rest of the world can enjoy the benefit provided by the 5G produced by Huawei, and the U.S. and its allies, or of those allies who want to sacrifice their own interests, can enjoy those relatively low qualified 5G technologies. And then in the future, the development of economies and the competitions among different actors will teach them our tough lessons. To be stupid, I think their allies are smart enough to do the good things.
I see. Mr. McDuffie, since the years I talked to you, you are always cool-minded, but at the same time very sharp. So may I ask you for the final question of today? The practice done by the current administration right now regarding so-called the companies of foreign adversary countries, what will the impact of this if others also use the same way as a weapon against American companies around the world? And meanwhile, will this set a big precedent negative to the global supply chain and the globalized economy?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that statement. I think everyone's kind of missing the point. There's a real opportunity for leadership at the international level here to address the global supply chain security issue, because it's so much broader than just Huawei or 5G. It really goes to probably 80–90% of the economy globally. Everyone's dependent on that. So I'm reminded of an expression that Ronald Reagan, I think, coined about back in the 80s: trust but verify. I mean, we have to have trusted relationships internationally, but at the same time, to address the national security aspects, we need to be able to verify things that are being presented on both sides. So it doesn't do any good for the United States to isolate itself. It doesn't do any good for any particular country to isolate itself from that global marketplace that's flourishing and will continue necessary for the advancement of all people. So we have to find a way to really deal with this issue of the security of that global supply chain.
I see. We are running out of time for this round of discussion, but certainly a lot to expect for the next few days and probably weeks as well, if not months. Thank you so much, the four of you, providing so much insight and also wisdom of your analysis. Thank you. Ernest McDuffie, Roger Antner, Andy Mark. Really appreciate it. Thank you, gentlemen.